Thank you for joining iMeet.
Or are typing, if you're using any of the chat functions or anything like that.
This meeting is now being recorded.
And there you are. We will have a Q&A session following the piece where I'm speaking, and that piece will not be recorded because I want everyone to feel as comfortable as they can be asking questions. So from there, I'm just going to jump in and start sharing my screen, and we will right away get into the presentation piece. So there we are. You should now see my screen, which has what every jeweler should know, Part 2, Canada's Changing Regulation. And I'm just going to start with a couple of quick housekeeping items. All participants who are on the call right now, other than myself, are currently on mute. It's not you. You guys are fantastic. It's your hold music. It's very easy in a call like this when we have a lot of people to have to do something else, to have to step away from your desk for a moment. I'm sure that your hold music is wonderful, but I want folks to pay attention to what we're saying and to be able to hear that. If you need to get my attention during the call, there is a chat feature within iMeet. It looks like a little speech bubble. Rodney McInnes, who's a member of my team here at Outlier, will be able to receive that message, so you can send it to him personally. You can send it to the whole room. And if it's very urgent, he'll actually run up and stick a Post-it on my screen. So if audio is not coming through, if video is not coming through, if there's any type of issue, please do let me know. At the end of the call, like I said, I will take everyone off mute so that you can ask questions, so that we can have more of a dialogue. I will also stop recording the call just prior to that point, like I said, because I want everyone to feel very comfortable asking questions. You can also submit a question. So as we're going along, you can submit a question using the speech bubble. Rodney will both type answers to that and bring them up at the end in the Q&A portion. And finally, the session is being recorded. If everything goes to plan, participants in this session will be able to review this session later, but of course, a recording can't answer your questions. As I mentioned, this is the third part in a three-part series. So the first part, presented a couple of weeks ago, was an AML 101. This is posted on YouTube, and so very generously, CJA and JVC had given me permission to post the entirety of that video on YouTube. It's available to you as members. It's available as well for general consumption for people who may want to become members and need to know how fantastic this is. For that portion, if you are looking for a very cheap and cheerful way to take care of some staff training, because that's the thing that you need to do in the near term, especially if you have a team that's not all located in an office where it's easy to have a meeting all at once, this is a potential tool that you can use in that regard. Today, we're going to be dealing specifically with changes effective in the legislation this year. And on June 13th, we're going to do the third part in this series, which will talk specifically to surviving a FinTrack exam. Hefty disclaimers. As a compliance nerd, this is always something I have to do. I'm not a lawyer. Nothing I say should be interpreted as legal advice. I don't represent any government or government agency. So while I know an awful lot about the way that FinTrack works, with the way that law enforcement works, I don't represent their official position. If you have any questions about a particular situation or a company, especially if it involves someone's name, confidential information, come and speak to me after the presentation. Give me a call. We can have a great chat, but please don't mention the name of a person even after we stop recording in a public forum. And the reason that I say this is that I once had someone stand up and say, oh, Joe Smith, who's my client, did something and it's really suspicious. And I realized listening to you that I should report a suspicious transaction to FinTrack. And that's not something that we want to be out there in a general context. But like I said, I'm happy to have those conversations after the presentation in private if there's something that you're not sure about. I'm going to start with a wall of acronyms. So just talking about a few terms that I'm going to use relatively frequently so that we're all on the same page. I believe very firmly that we should always start by explaining acronyms before we jump into a presentation that has a bunch of acronyms. So AML, anti-money-laundering, fairly straightforward there. CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. CTF, counter-terrorist financing. Alternately, this has also been referred to as ATF or anti-terrorist financing. When I refer to DPMSs, I'm talking about dealers in precious metals and stones, and so that is all of you on this call. FinTrack, of course, is the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. So they are our financial intelligence unit as well as our regulator in the jewelry industry. When I refer to the PCML-TFA, I'm referring to the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. I might also generally refer to regulations. And when I say regulations, I'm not talking about any regulations. There are actually 5 pieces of regulation that fall under the PCML-TFA. So in this context, when we talk about regulation, we'll be talking about those specific regulations. Equally, when we talk about guidance, we'll usually be talking about guidance that FINTRAC has issued since they are our regulator. And finally, the RCMP, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our federal police force here in Canada. And just to do a quick recap, as a jeweler, you're required to have an anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing program. That program has to have 5 elements, and we'll be going through the changes to any of these elements and anything that you need to do operationally. The first one of those things that you need to do is appoint a compliance officer. A compliance officer is a person who oversees compliance. This doesn't mean that you need to go out and hire someone external to your organization. If you run a very small family business and you own that business, congratulations, I'm sorry, this is probably you within that organization. It is important that that person stays up to date on Canadian anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing requirements for jewelers. It's also important that that person has access to your senior management team. So especially if you're a much larger business, you can't say to your newest cashier and salesperson, congratulations, you're the compliance officer, good luck, deal with that. Because that person, if there was a problem, is probably not going to feel as comfortable approaching your senior management team. They're not going to feel as comfortable going to the CEO and saying, hey, I don't think that we're really doing what we need to be doing. You know, we're not identifying our customers in the right situations, or there's a suspicious transaction that needs to be reported. Whatever the case is, that person needs to be able to have a dialogue with the senior-most people in your organization comfortably. They need to have the right level of influence. They need to have the right level of knowledge. They need to have the right level of support. And if you can say yes to all of those things, you've got the right person as your compliance officer. You need to develop policies and procedures. So these are documents that outline what you're doing in order to comply with all these laws and rules and regulations. A policy is generally something that talks about what you have to do, whereas a procedure talks about how you do those things. So what are the very specific steps that you take in order to get there? You need to complete a risk assessment. And a risk assessment in this context is something that describes how your business is vulnerable and could be used to either launder money or finance terrorism, and then the controls that you have in place to prevent that from happening. You need to train your employees. So anyone that deals with a customer or a transaction should be receiving training about once a year. And this is training specifically on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. And finally, you need to do effectiveness reviews. This is like an audit, but for compliance. So it needs to test that you have a program, that that program is effective, that all of these elements are in place, and that you're actually doing the things that you say that you're doing. There needs to be a formal report that's generated from this process, and this needs to be completed every 2 years. This can be completed by external consulting firms, so Outlier does this type of work. This can also be completed in-house if you have the skill set. Either way, the requirements are exactly the same, and it is something that has to be documented. When we talk about these requirements, it's important to remember that it's not enough to be doing these things. It's not enough to know these things. Everything that you have to do from an AML perspective, from a CTF perspective, always has to be documented. So you have to be able to prove it. In the case that FINTRAC, who is our regulator, comes in the case that you're going through an effectiveness review process, so remember that that's just like an audit, and it's not enough to say to your accountant, I'm pretty sure that all of the money that comes into and out of my accounts balances and all of our sales records are fine. It's all in my head. I know it. I understand it. That wouldn't suffice in an audit context. It won't suffice in this context. So you have to be able to prove that all of these things are truly happening. In terms of policies and procedures, what's changing in 2017, the methods that you use to identify your customers. And we'll go through these specifically. Remember that your policies and procedures need to talk about not only what you have to do, but how you're doing these things. So because the requirements are changing in terms of how you go about these processes, you actually need to update the policies and procedures as well. Reasonable measures. So in certain instances, I might not be able to identify a customer. I might not be able to confirm that an organization exists or who owns that organization. And in that case, I have to document the reasonable measures that I took to do those things. So what steps did I take to try to ask for identification? What steps did I take to try to get documentation? Why wasn't I able to do that? And sometimes what was the consequence of my not being able to do that? So did I consider that to be a higher risk organization, for example, if my customer is a business, but that business wasn't able to substantiate for me or wasn't willing to substantiate for me who actually owned the business? The reporting timelines for suspicious transactions have changed. So for most of us, this is going to seem like a very minor tweak in the wording, but it is nonetheless important. Domestic politically exposed persons. So as a jeweler, you don't actually have a requirement to look for politically exposed persons or heads of international organizations, but you should be aware of them. And if they are your clients and they are doing certain types of activities, you might consider them to be more high risk. Your risk assessment. So this is this assessment of the risk that your business could be used to launder money or finance terrorism. There are two new categories. The first of these categories is going to be affiliates. So this has a very specific meaning within the context of the law. And this means businesses that either you own in whole or in part, or businesses that own your business in whole or in part. When we do our risk assessments for our clients, we also like to consider any businesses that fall under that tree. So for instance, if Outlier Solutions Inc., which is my company, was owned by a holding company, so we had Outlier Holdings Inc., and Outlier Holdings also owned 3 other companies, it can be prudent to consider the risk associated with those companies as well. Now again, for dealers in precious metals and stones, this is not a requirement, but it certainly is a best practice. And it's something that we've seen questions come up about in FINTRAC examinations. So from my perspective, I think that it's always better to think about these things at the outset before you're in an exam context trying to explain the risk associated with these things. The second of these is new developments and technologies. This is anything that's changed about your business, anything that's changed about the technology that you used. Did you implement a new point of sale system, for instance? Did you implement a new website? Did you start selling your products and services online where before it was always in a face-to-face context? These are all things that you would think about under new developments. It's also important under new developments to think about the patterns that are associated with your business. So for example, if last year the average value of a sale in my store was $200, and this year the average value of a sale in my store was $2,000, I'm going to want to talk about what accounted for that difference. I'm going to want to be able to demonstrate that I understand what's actually happening in my business and that I understand the risk associated with my activities. And so these are becoming much more detail-oriented questions. New developments is really there to be able to show that you've done an assessment of what's changed year over year. Along with your compliance program documents, these should be updated before June 30th. So watch for an announcement very soon. We are in the midst of putting the final touches on the compliance kit online in terms of the updates that are happening there. One other piece that's fairly important is the risk assessment that FINTRAC has devised. And so this is not legislation, this is guidance. But if you are a pragmatist, this is something that you're going to think about. FINTRAC has identified a number of areas as being high risk that we might not traditionally think of as being high risk in our world. And I won't be able to hear if anyone's giggling on the phone as I say these, but these include things like buying precious metals and stones, selling precious metals and stones, as well as jewelry, so buying and selling, essentially everything that makes us a dealer in precious metals and stones. And in terms of the delivery channels, anything that you're selling in a way that's non-face-to-face. So if I'm not meeting with my customer in person, FINTRAC is generally considering that to be higher risk than if I am meeting with my customer in person. Now, when I say that there's a pragmatic approach to that, what I mean is that whether or not you agree that selling a piece of finished jewelry can potentially be or should be considered high risk for money laundering or terrorist financing, when we know that our regulator is considering it high risk, I think that the right approach in a lot of ways is to say, okay, when I do my risk assessment, I'll look at the inherent risk. And that's the risk before any controls have been applied. So if it's the Wild West, I'm not identifying customers, I'm not doing anything, I am simply selling finished jewelry, and that thing can be considered inherently high risk. That's what FINTRAC is saying about it. Then we'll look at it that way. The important piece is where you get to in terms of your controls. So you, of course, apply control processes. You have everything logged in your system. You identify your customers at certain thresholds. All of those things that you do to make sure that your business is safe and sound and not being used for money laundering and terrorist financing. Once those are applied, you have what's called inherent risk. So that's the risk that's left over after all of your control processes. And it's not necessarily a bad thing if your risk before controls, so that inherent risk, if that's high, not a big deal. But you want to make sure that your risk after your controls have been applied. So once I do everything that I'm going to do to make sure that my business is safe and sound, is that control still high? Or rather, is that risk still high? And at that point, you want to be dealing with something that's an acceptable level of risk rather than a high level of risk. If you are going to read any source document, so anything that's been written by FINTRAC, if you're feeling like you'd like some great reading material, this risk-based approach workbook is probably the best piece of guidance that I've seen in quite a while. It is tailored to our industry. There are still some elements of that aren't perfect. The JVC and CJA have been very engaged with FINTRAC in terms of having those conversations about how things can be more tailored, how we can have stronger examples of things that are risky, of things that are red flags, so something that might be potentially suspicious, that are appropriate at both the wholesale and retail level for dealers in precious metals and stones. So while it's not perfect, it is still, I think, a very strong piece of guidance. And we've been told that we can expect more guidance from FINTRAC this year, which will be customized to our industry. And I think that's fantastic news. In terms of training, what's changing in 2017, you can use mandatories. So it's not a typo of the word mandatory. It is a mandatory is in a person who carries out a mandate. Not a word I made up, but the way that it's actually written within the regulation itself. This can be any person or organization that's identifying a customer on your behalf. They're also sometimes referred to as agents. But if you're using a mandatory or an agent, so if you say to me, Amber, you are located in Toronto, I am located in Victoria, I have some customers in Toronto, can you go and collect identification from those customers for me? And I go and do that thing for you. You now have a responsibility to make sure that I receive anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing training, the same as any other member of your staff would, even though I'm not necessarily an employee in this context. And this is because I'm carrying out what's considered to be the relatively important function in AML and CTF of identifying a customer. Just a quick recap before we jump into the things that you actually have to do to be compliant in terms of reporting. You need to report large cash transactions. And when I talk about cash, I always mean cash. So it's not credit cards, it's not traveler's checks, it's not anything other than bills or coins. So really cash. If it's over $10,000, and this includes 2 or more transactions in the same 24-hour period, that's something that you need to report to FINTRAC within 15 calendar days. Suspicious transactions, and these can be transactions that are either attempted or completed. And what I mean by a transaction that's attempted is if I come to you and I ask you to do something for me. So for instance, if I'm asking you to sell me gold bars, and I'd like to buy an awful lot of gold bars, and I'd always like to pay for them in cash, but I don't want you to collect my identification information. I don't want you to make any reports to FINTRAC about me. And you say, you know, sorry, Amber, we can't do that for you. If you're going to buy gold bars for us and you're going to pay with cash, we're going to need to collect your identification. So you're either going to need to give us a credit card or give us your identification, but we can't do the transaction in cash otherwise. And I say, okay, fine then. And walk out. And so you've not been able to get my identification. You didn't actually complete a transaction for me, but it seems pretty shady that I've done that. So that's an attempted transaction that you would still need to report to FINTRAC. And the last one is a terrorist property report. So these need to be reported as soon as possible, pretty much immediate as you can get. And these also get reported to CSIS, so that Canadian Security Intelligence Service, as well as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP. What's changing in 2017? Suspicious transactions, so those suspicious, whether they're completed or attempted, need to be reported within 30 calendar days from the day that you have discovery of a fact that causes you to be suspicious. For most of us, this is really not going to seem like a change. So most of us have really treated it as something happens, I need to make a report to FinTrack, and I'll make that report within 30 days of the date that that thing happened. The way that the law was previously written, it was 30 days from the date that you decided that the transaction was suspicious. And unfortunately, what this meant for a lot of institutions, especially some bigger institutions, not in the jewelry world, not to point any fingers at banks, but we're talking about banks. Big institutions had issues where they had thousands upon thousands of alerts that were generated by their transaction monitoring systems. And what I mean by an alert is something that a person has to make a decision about that says, this transaction might be suspicious for money laundering or terrorist financing. Someone needs to look at it. Someone needs to investigate it. Because they had thousands of alerts in a backlog, but no one had made a decision, they took the tack that they didn't have to report these to FinTrack yet. So because the clock didn't start ticking until the point where we make a decision, if we don't make a decision, the clock's not ticking. And this was specifically rewritten to change that, to say as soon as you're in possession of all the facts. So that day that I come into your store and I say, hey, I want to do this transaction. I want to do it in cash. I don't want you to take my ID. I don't want you to make reports to the government. And I'll do lots of transactions like this with you over the years if you'll simply agree to never take my identification information, never record any information about me, and never make any reports to FinTrack or any of the other required reports that you're supposed to do. At that point, you are in possession of all of the information that you need to decide that's pretty shady, that's suspicious, that's something where there should probably be a report. And that's the point at which the clock starts ticking. So now it's not about when you as a reporting entity make a decision, it's about when you had all of the information that you needed in order to make that decision. Now, in some cases, you might have a first transaction that doesn't necessarily set you off in terms of being suspicious, and then someone comes back and does a second transaction. And at the point of that second transaction, you look at those two things together and you say, you know what, that doesn't really make sense. So the first time, if I come in and I say, okay, I want to buy this gold bar, how much is it? Okay, I'm going to go and get you, cash from my bank. And I go, and I've selected the one that's as close to $10,000 without going over as I can. And then I specifically come back 2 days later. So I'm coming back outside of that 24-hour period, and I'm buying the exact same thing. And I come back 2 days later and I buy that exact same, or as close to $10,000 without going over bar as I can. At that point, you might say, okay, taken together, this seems really odd. And you might ask me about those transactions, but at that point, you're in possession of enough information to make a decision that it was suspicious. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you don't necessarily sell me that gold bar. You can continue to do that transaction to your heart's content. But because it's suspicious, you have to try to identify me. You have to take reasonable measures, document what those reasonable measures are in order to identify me. And you have to file that suspicious transaction report with FinTrack. So customer identification information, this is what I was just alluding to. For large cash transactions, it is required. So the expectation is really that you're not going to sell something to a person where they want to pay $10,000 or more in cash without collecting their identification information. For any other type of transaction, you're looking at reasonable measures to identify that person. If your customer in that case is an organization, so if I'm not buying a piece for me as Amber Scott, if I'm buying a piece for Outlier, which is a company, then you need to do things to confirm the existence and ownership of that company. And so in the case of a large cash transaction, it's required, it's expected that you're going to decline the transaction. And this doesn't mean that you can't process the transaction in some other way. So if I were to look at it and say, oh, okay, so if I pay you guys in cash, I have to provide all this information about my company. And so for instance, I'd have to go and find my articles of incorporation to prove that my company existed. I'd have to give you my shareholder register. And that seems like an awful lot of paperwork. Why don't we instead just make a payment on my company credit card, and we'll do the purchase that way instead? Then you're looking at a very different situation. For folks in the wholesale world, because this is most commonly where I see large cash transactions, I see them very often with wholesalers that are selling to a retailer, and the retailer maybe hasn't done a great job in terms of making their payments on time. Maybe they've had a check that bounced. Maybe they've had some cards that have been declined or issues with things like that. And in those cases, I've seen wholesalers that will actually ask the retailer to pay them for the stock items that they're providing in cash. What I'm going to recommend in this case, you still need to do everything that you need to do to identify the person who's in front of you, to confirm the existence of that organization. But of course, you can simply keep it in your file and just make sure that that's up to date on a regular basis. But what I'm going to recommend in those situations where you are actually the one who is requesting that payment be made to you in cash because of previous billing issues, again, when we go back to that prove it, be able to talk about it, document that in your file, because there is a difference between this large cash transaction and something that's a potentially suspicious transaction. If I'm a wholesaler and I'm dealing with a retailer who's buying things from me on a frequent basis in cash, and those items tend to be, maybe sometimes just below $10,000, maybe somewhere around that mark, and this is happening on a regular basis, and you have someone either doing an effectiveness review or you have FinTrack in, they might ask the question in terms of why these transactions are happening, why they look the way they do, why they're happening in cash when most of your customers who are retailers aren't paying you in cash. So you want to have good documentation to be able to explain those. In terms of customer identification, if you're identifying them face-to-face, the identification that they present has to be a photo ID. So that's new. You have to record the expiry date of the identification. So previously you had to know that it was valid, but you didn't have to record the expiry date. There are a couple of new non-face-to-face identification methods. These are much nicer. So we're in a transition period until the end of June. These are much nicer than the previous identification methods that you could use if you were identifying someone non-face-to-face. If you use agents or mandatories, again, you need to make sure that you're providing training for them. And if you can't collect information or identification, you have to document the reasonable measures that you took to do so. And whenever I talk about documenting these, it doesn't mean that you need to take a video of you trying to collect someone's ID. It means that there should be a note somewhere in the file that says that this happened. I asked the person for their identification. They told me to go fly a kite and left the store. So you've got something that just clearly explains what happened. As much as possible, when you take those reasonable measures notes, don't use abbreviations and short forms. Those should be easy enough to understand that someone who wasn't involved in the situation could read your notes 2 years later without asking you a single question and know exactly what happened. They should be easy to find in your system. So if there was a point where I had completed a transaction or attempted a transaction and you had taken reasonable measures to identify me, it should be really easy to find in conjunction with that. So you should know when that happened. You should know where it happened. You should know what staff member is involved, all of those types of details. There is a situation in which you are not required, in the case of a suspicious transaction or an attempted suspicious transaction, to identify a person. And that would be in the case that you think that doing so would tip them off, so it would let them know that you are potentially thinking of filing a suspicious transaction report. And so in that case, you wouldn't identify them. I'm going to add to that if there's ever a case where you feel like you are in danger, where you feel like your safety or your security is in jeopardy, you've also hit that threshold, do keep that in your documentation later on. So if you have someone who's come in who's behaving aggressively, who maybe is behaving threateningly, you want to get that person out of your shop. You want to get them out of your office. Please don't follow them to the parking lot and feel like you need to take down their license plate number. Please don't get in your car and follow them to a secondary location and take note of that location. As exciting as those things sound, and they really are things that colleagues and clients of ours have done, I don't encourage those things. There is nothing under these rules that require you to put yourself in harm's way. Quite the contrary, none of us want to see you in harm's way, so be aware of that. Reasonable measures will never mean putting yourself in harm's way. If you're meeting with someone face-to-face, the identification that you look at should be issued by a government. It should be valid, so this means that it's not expired and acceptable ID. And in this picture where I'm holding up my hands apologetically, is because I'm holding up an Ontario health card. And Ontario health cards very specifically cannot be used as ID, so this is a law that we have at a provincial level that says that you cannot use a health card as identification in order to do anything other than access healthcare services. The ID needs to have a unique identifier number. It has to bear the name of your customer. It has to have a photo of your customer. In terms of the information, there's a laundry list of information that you have to keep. If you have to keep a record of the identity of your customer, the only things about that have really changed are that in terms of where the ID comes from, it's now the place of issue and the country it's issued. So if you're looking at my driver's license and it's an Ontario driver's license, you need to have recorded Ontario, Canada, and you also need to have recorded the expiry date of that document. So not just that it was a good, valid document, but when it actually expired. If the ID does not have an expiry date, and there are a few of these that will actually meet every other criteria on this list, but they don't have an expiry date, then you can write down that that document did not have a specific expiry date. Just a quick recap in terms of some of this information, because I think it's fairly important. The customer's full name, so this should be their full legal name, so no initials, no short forms, no abbreviations. If my name is Amber Dawn, but I go by AD, you can still, if you have something like a VIP customer program, you can still send mail to AD. But when you do any reports to FINTRAC, when you keep that official record of who I am, you want my full name to be there. The customer's occupation, this needs to be as detailed as possible, again, in full form without any abbreviations. And when I say as detailed as possible, in my case, you would want something not just consultant, compliance consulting firm owner. Those would both be okay, but consultant by itself is going to be problematic because it's not detailed enough. If in doubt, ask for a little bit more detail. The customer's date of birth, and this should be the same as what appears on the identification document. The customer's full home address, and it has to be, if you're identifying a person, a home address. You can still send mail to another address. So I have to give you my home address if I'm being identified. You have to record my home address, but I might still want my mail sent to my office or sent to a PO box or sent to someone else's residence. And that's A-okay in terms of where you're sending mail, but you do have to collect the person's full residential address. Their phone number, again, that place and country of issue, the identification number, so this is just that driver's license number, passport number, and the expiry date of the identification. If it doesn't have one, keep a note to say that there was no expiry date, or else those get very confusing in terms of a FINTRAC examination or an effectiveness review, because it looks like you haven't collected information when actually that information didn't exist for that piece of identification. So it just makes your life a little bit easier to record it in the first place if there is no expiry date for that identification. If you do meet with your customer face-to-face, there was previously a rule that said that you could only accept a piece of government-issued ID. So if you had ever met with someone in person, you could never use any non-face-to-face method of identification. That's actually changed. So now, even if you've had a meeting with me, you could still identify me non-face-to-face later on. In certain circumstances, so if I come in and see you and I say, I'm doing a large cash transaction, and instead of showing you a driver's license or passport, you're doing a credit file method or one of these other methods in order to identify me, You might probably want to keep a note about the reason that is. So it may be that I forgot my wallet that day, but I still wanted to conduct a transaction, and that may fly, but you may also consider that to be suspicious under certain circumstances. So in the case of non-face-to-face identification, you can refer to a credit file. So these are issued by Canadian credit bureaus. Right now, those are either Equifax or TransUnion for commercial credit. That credit file has to have been in existence for at least 3 years. You're doing a credit header match. And what that means is that it doesn't have any impact to the person's credit score. All it's matching is saying there's a credit file, it's existed for 3 years, the name matches, the date of birth matches, the address matches. And then you've identified your customer. So this can be done in a relatively automated way. If you're doing that, you need to keep a record of the customer's name, what was the name of the credit bureau that was holding the credit file, what was the credit file reference number, and what was the date that you consulted it. When we talk about record keeping, any of these records are still records that you need to maintain for at least 5 years. You can also use a dual process method. So this allows you to refer to any 2 of these options. So you can check documents or information from any reliable source that contain either a name and a date of birth, a name and an address, or confirming that you have an account with a financial entity. And financial entity in this context is only going to mean a Canadian financial entity. In terms of name and address, there's a list, and this is a list provided by FinTrack. It's provided in their guidance. We will also provide a chart that covers this really well in terms of what they look at as acceptable documents in the updates to the AML and CTF program. So what's considered reliable? Any card or statement that's issued by the Canadian government or government body, a benefit statement, documents from CRA, which is Canada Revenue Agency, documents that are issued by other Canadian sources. And so here, we talked earlier about if I had a Canadian credit bureau and I had that bureau for at least 3 years and you did a credit header match, you could use that all by itself as a method of identification. But if I have 6 months or more of credit bureau history, but less than 3 years, then you can use that as one method in conjunction with other things. You can also use things like a T4 statement, a record of employment, an investment account statement. There are specific identification products that Canadian credit bureaus use. You can also use documents that are issued in this context by a foreign government. Again, if you have to believe that those documents are reliable, you have to believe that they're authentic. One of the important things to know about any documents under any of the pieces that we're talking about with the dual process method is that they have to be original. What this means is that if you can use something to confirm my name and address, it's relatively simple. So you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, we'll use your property tax assessment because that has your name and address on it. If I got that property tax assessment as a PDF, so if the city that I live in sent it to me electronically, I can send it to you electronically. If the city that I live in sent that to me on paper, I cannot scan it and send it to you. I cannot take a picture of it and send it to you. The copy of the document that you see needs to be an original. And this means that when you're looking at these documents, if you're having someone send them in, you need to pay attention to things like whether or not it's written on, whether it looks like there's a fold in the document, or whether it looks like it was an electronic PDF document when it was generated. Documents that you can use to confirm the name and date of birth. And I think this is probably one of the hardest ones to do just in terms of, documents that you receive electronically, because not a lot of things that you're going to receive electronically are going to have both your name and date of birth. So it's a little bit more difficult than your name and address, where I think that it's pretty easy to get something, to have someone send you something like a utility bill, which is going to have a name and address on it. So there are a number of different sources that you can use. Again, this is a source where if you have that more than 6 months or 6 months or more rather of Canadian credit bureau history, but less than 3 years of Canadian credit bureau history, this can be a good source in terms of the name and date of birth for that individual. And finally, for the dual process method, you can confirm that that person has an account with a Canadian financial institution. So this can be through a credit card statement, bank statement, loan statement, really any type of statement. You can also make a phone call to the financial institution. If you choose to do that, of course, you want to document who called, when did you call, what was the time, what was the date, who did you speak to, what number did you call. So you really want to be able to show all of the details about the fact that that phone call was made. And then, of course, from a privacy perspective, you're going to make sure that that customer is on the phone with you when you're calling their bank, simply because if I called and said, I'm interested, I'm calling Rodney McInnes's bank, and I'm calling to find out if he has a bank account with TD, TD is going to realize very quickly that I'm not Rodney McInnes, and that I shouldn't have access to that file and not give me any type of answers or information about him, including whether or not he has an account there, unless Rodney McInnes is on the phone with me and he is able to authenticate himself and give them consent to be able to confirm that he has an account there. The other bit that is important about that, if you are going to make a call to a bank or another financial institution and that's how you're doing your confirmation, use a phone number that is either from the back of a physical card from that institution, so the 1-800 number that's on the back of a bank card, use the 1-800 numbers that are on the bank's website. Don't simply use a local telephone number that the customer gives you, because this is something that we've seen in a number of different fraud cases in other industries. So I haven't heard of a case of this in the jewelry industry, but I know that it does happen, where if I'm trying to pretend to be someone else, and I'm trying to authenticate myself, or I'm trying to use an identity that's completely false, what I'll do is I'll say, oh yeah, that's fine. We can get on the phone with my banker, and here's his number, and it's 647 yada yada yada. And what I give you is not really the number for that TD branch. What I'm giving you is Rodney's cell phone number, and he's my accomplice, and he's ready to answer the phone and say, hello, TD Bank. Oh yes, we're happy to confirm that for you. Miss Scott definitely has an account with us, and she's a great customer, and you should extend her lots of credit, when, of course, that isn't true. Again, those accounts for that purpose must be Canadian financial institution accounts. If you have customers that only have accounts or holdings overseas, unfortunately, this isn't going to be a good method to be able to identify them. In these cases, you need to keep a record of the customer's name. What were the two sources that you used to identify the customer? So those have to be different sources. I can't, for instance, if I called TD Bank, I can't use TD Bank for both to confirm that someone has an account with them, as well as to confirm their name and address or name and date of birth. I have to go to a different source for that second piece of information. The type of information that you use, what the account number was, if there was one associated with that information. If there was no account number, you have to keep some sort of reference number that's associated with that information, and I would generally add that you should put a description of what that reference number is if it's not an account number, and the date that you verified that information. If you're using agents or mandatories, so you have someone that's meeting with your customer and identifying your customer on your behalf, then you need to have an agreement with them. That agreement needs to be in writing. In writing can mean electronic as well, so it doesn't mean a wet signature, but it means that there is a documented agreement that you can show that happened between the two parties, and that agreement was entered into before they identified anyone on your behalf. The person or entity must be considered in your training program, so anyone who's acting as your agent or mandatory has to receive training from you. And it may be considered a higher risk delivery channel, because again, in FINTRAC's risk assessment guidance, they talk about customers that we do not meet with face-to-face potentially being higher risk. In terms of the information that you need to keep in these cases, you need to keep the information about the client identification. So what you would normally keep in that case, you would need to keep the name of the entity or the person that identified your client. You need to keep a copy of that written agreement. You need to keep track of the identification method that was used, the information that was gathered according to that identification method, the date of the verification, and the date that you referred to their verification of your client. And what that means is, if I identify your client on your behalf today, but you don't look at that documentation until tomorrow, that needs to be accounted for in your records. What the difference is, or the lag is, if there is any, between when I conducted that identification for you and when you looked at it and said, yes, this customer has really been identified. If customers are organizations, and again, this is only when you need to identify your customer. So in that case of large cash transaction, suspicious transaction, attempted suspicious transaction, potential terrorist property, you want their full legal name, the organization structure. So is it incorporated? Is it a trust company? Is it a partnership? Because that's going to change what documentation you want to get about the organization. Their principal business, so just like occupation, this is what does that organization do? What's its purpose? Their physical address, again, this can't be a post office box or general delivery address. Their telephone number, and information about the organization's key persons. So that's going to be the people that own or control that organization, and there are a couple of specifics depending on the type of organization. If they're an incorporated company, you also need to get their incorporation number and their place of incorporation. If they're a not-for-profit, you have to ask a couple of extra questions, and you have to record the answers to those questions. So do they solicit donations from the public? Are they a registered charity in Canada? If they are a registered charity, you want to collect that charitable registration number. Key persons, so who is considered a beneficial owner, so anyone who owns or controls 25% or more of the organization, is going to change depending on the type of organization. I think one of the important ones here, so if it's an incorporated company, you need a list of all of their directors, you need a list of anyone who owns or controls 25% or more. Very similar with other types of organizations. And with trusts, you're looking for a list of all trustees, known beneficiaries, and settlers of that trust. You need to take reasonable measures in these cases to confirm that the organization exists, to confirm what its address is, what its structure is, what its ownership is, and who its signing authority is. So who's the person in front of you that's acting on behalf of the organization. The type of documentation that you get is going to depend on the type of organization that it is. And what I mean by this is, if you're talking about an incorporated company or a partnership, you are probably going to have something like articles of incorporation that brought that company into existence, which is very different from the case that I have an informal organization whose sole purpose is to collect money related to chocolate bar sales for my nephew's hockey team. That's a very different instance where the only thing that I might have to show that that organization exists might be minutes from a meeting. It might be a resolution between a couple of people. So what you should expect for an informal versus formal organization are fairly different, but whatever you're collecting needs to make sense for that organization. In terms of what's next, just after actually this webinar, you're going to receive a handout that outlines all of these changes. You'll also receive PDF copies of these slides. You should have your AML and CTF program updated before June 30th. This should include replacing any forms that you're using when you identify your customers. And this is specifically because there are a couple of extra pieces of information that we need to collect. Specifically, if you're collecting an identification document from your customer in person, you want to make sure that you're capturing that expiry date, and you want to make sure that you're capturing both the place and the country of issue. If you've already done training for your staff this year, you may need to do a quick little update and just talk to them about the things that are changing. And again, these are relatively straightforward. If they're collecting ID, it needs to be a photo ID. They need to collect the expiry date. They need to make sure that they're collecting both the place and country of issue. And from there, I'm just going to switch and stop recording for a moment. And after I've stopped recording, I will take everyone off of mute and we will open up for questions.